They say everything is bigger in Texas, and that includes the egos of some HOA presidents. Until recently, I wouldn't have known, living on my 10-acre lake ranch nestled just outside the official boundary of our small town's HOA. My property was a world apart, a slice of rural paradise where the only rules were those laid down by nature. At least, that's what I thought until Greg, the HOA president and self-appointed enforcer of all things neighborly, decided my land was fair game for his power trip. It started innocently enough. I'd always loved fishing and I'd turned my little private lake into a haven for it. Stocked it myself, maintained the banks, even built a small dock. Over time, a few locals, mostly kids and weekend anglers, started coming by to fish. I didn't charge anyone, I just enjoyed the company and the idea of sharing the tranquility of the place. Someone jokingly called it the Ranch Fishing Club, and the name stuck. Apparently that name made its way to Greg. One Saturday morning I found a letter taped to my gate. No stamp, just HOA branded stationery. Read, "Dear Mr. Lane, it has come to our attention that you are operating an unauthorized recreational facility on your property. This is a violation of HOA Bylaw 17B, which requires prior registration and approval for all community clubs and activities. To avoid further penalties, please cease all fishing activities immediately and remit a $500 fine payable to the HOA Treasury. Sincerely, Greg Thompson, HOA President." I laughed so hard I scared off a flock of ducks. Unauthorized recreational facility? On my land? I wasn't even part of the HOA. I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash, figuring Greg had made a mistake. But over the next few weeks, the letters kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. One threatened to involve the county zoning board, another warned of potential legal consequences. Then came the fine. A thick envelope showed up in my mailbox, containing a formal invoice for $1,500. Greg had upped the ante, claiming I was profiting off my illegal operation. I was tempted to frame it as a trophy of absurdity, but my irritation got the better of me. When I called Greg to set things straight, he didn't even bother pretending to be polite. "Mr. Lane," he said, his tone oozing condescension, "it's not personal. We just have to maintain standards. Your activities are attracting outsiders. It's not good for property values." "Greg," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm, "I'm not in your HOA. My land is private, and your bylaws don't apply to me." "Well, technically you're adjacent," he replied, stretching the word like it could magically make it true. "We're just trying to be proactive. You wouldn't want this to escalate." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about me. Greg and his HOA cronies were using scare tactics to bully anyone they thought they could push around. That's when I decided to dig into their paperwork. Late one night, armed with a strong cup of coffee and an internet connection, I started researching. My first stop was the County Records Office's online database. It didn't take long to confirm what I already knew. My property was completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. But as I read through their bylaws and annual reports, conveniently available online, something else caught my attention. There were discrepancies in their maps, old boundaries that didn't match their claims in recent filings. It looked like they'd redrawn their jurisdiction lines without going through proper channels. And then there was the fine print in their financial reports. The fines they'd been collecting from offenders, like me, were being lumped into an unaccounted-for community improvement fund. Suspicious didn't even begin to cover it. I didn't know exactly what I was dealing with yet, but one thing was clear. Greg and the HOA weren't just overstepping. They were scheming. And I was about to become their worst nightmare. The fines didn't stop. Every week, another envelope from the HOA appeared in my mailbox, each one more aggressive than the last. The latest demanded $3,000, citing cumulative infractions. The absurdity was almost comical, but the mounting threats started to feel less like a joke and more like a declaration of war. It was time to fight back. First, I needed reinforcements. My neighbor Maria had lived in the area for decades. Her ranch bordered mine, and she'd had her own run-ins with the HOA over her free-range chickens. Over a cup of her strong-as-nails coffee, I showed her the stack of fines. "Typical Greg," she said, shaking her head. "He's been trying to expand the HOA's reach for years. You're not the first person he's tried to bully." Maria's words confirmed my suspicions. The HOA's behavior wasn't just an overreach, it was part of a pattern. She even introduced me to a couple of other landowners who'd received similar threats. Their stories painted a clear picture. Greg and his crew were attempting to extend their control and their revenue far beyond their legal boundaries. Next, I called in a lawyer friend, Sam, who specialized in property law. After I explained the situation, he agreed to look over the HOA's claims. "This is amateur hour," he said after an evening of poring over their documents. "They have no authority over your property and these fines are unenforceable. In fact, the way they've worded these notices could land them in hot water." That's exactly what I wanted to hear. But Sam wasn't done. "There's something else here," he said, pointing to a section of their bylaws. "They're claiming jurisdiction based on a revised boundary map, but there's no record of this map being approved by the county." Sam's discovery was the crack in Greg's armor. If the HOA's boundaries were illegitimate, their entire foundation of authority could crumble. I filed a formal complaint with the county, requesting an investigation into their practices. Meanwhile, I kept digging. Late one night, while scrolling through the Texas Wildlife Department's website, I stumbled upon an old statute about private land conservation. It detailed a program that allowed landowners to designate their property as a wildlife reserve, providing legal protections and tax benefits. Intrigued, I read further. The program emphasized community involvement and conservation efforts, both of which my informal fishing club already promoted. A plan began to form. I started gathering evidence. I took pictures of the lake, the fish, and the local wildlife that frequented my property. I compiled testimonials from the families who came to fish and from Maria, who raved about how my lake supported local ecology. Then I reached out to a biologist from a nearby university who was more than happy to visit and provide an assessment. "This is an excellent habitat," he said, jotting notes as we walked the property. "You've got native species thriving here. With a little formal documentation, this could absolutely qualify as a wildlife reserve." By the end of the week, I had everything I needed to file the application. But I wasn't just applying for a designation. I was crafting a narrative, one that painted my lake as a beacon of conservation and community. I submitted my paperwork and waited. In the meantime, the county's investigation into the HOA was gaining momentum. Maria, Sam, and the other landowners had all submitted statements, corroborating my claims of overreach and intimidation. I even managed to get my hands on some internal emails from a disgruntled HOA board member who'd had enough of Greg's antics. The emails detailed their strategy of targeting non-HOA properties to boost their budget. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the Texas Wildlife Department approved my application. My ranch was now officially recognized as a private wildlife reserve. The designation came with legal protections that not only shielded my property from the HOA but also made any attempts to interfere with my activities a potential violation of state law. Armed with this new status, I was ready for the next round. Greg and his HOA weren't going to know what hit them. With my property officially designated as a wildlife reserve, I felt a new sense of purpose, and an undeniable spark of mischief. The designation wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon, one I planned to wield with surgical precision against Greg and his HOA empire. The first step was to spread the word. I updated the old Ranch Fishing Club name to the Blue Heron Wildlife Reserve, complete with a professional-looking website and a logo featuring a stately heron. I added a section for educational programs, conservation updates, and a gallery of wildlife sightings. Some real, some strategically curated from my trail cameras. The site was a hit, drawing attention from local schools and nature enthusiasts. But I wasn't done yet. If Greg wanted to play bureaucratic hardball, I was ready to show him how it's really done. First, I installed motion-activated cameras around the property. Officially, they were for research and security purposes, but their real purpose was to monitor Greg and his HOA henchmen. Sure enough, within days of the reserve's announcement, Greg was spotted lurking near the property line with a clipboard and a tape measure, muttering to one of his cronies. I saved the footage, it would come in handy later. Next, I set up a small but conspicuous visitor center at the edge of my property. It was little more than a shed with a couple of picnic tables and some educational signage about the lake's ecosystem. The centerpiece was a laminated poster explaining the legal protections granted to wildlife reserves under state law. I made sure the section about trespassing penalties was bold and underlined. It didn't take long for Greg to make his next move. One sunny afternoon, I caught him and two HOA board members pacing in front of the visitor center, loudly debating whether it violated zoning ordinances. I strolled over, coffee in hand. "Afternoon, Greg," I said, smiling. "Something I can help you with?" Greg's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. "Mr. Lane, this structure appears to be non-compliant with local regulations. You'll need to remove it immediately." I took a sip of coffee. Actually, Greg, as a designated wildlife reserve, This property is governed by state conservation laws. The visitor center is fully compliant. But hey, if you'd like to discuss it further, I can call the Texas Wildlife Department. They're big fans of the reserve. In fact, they might like to know about your frequent visits. Greg's jaw clenched. We'll see about that, he snapped, storming off with his lackeys in tow. A few days later, I received notice that the HOA was filing a formal complaint against the reserve, claiming it was a nuisance and detrimental to community standards. They demanded a hearing with the county zoning board. I welcomed the challenge. At the hearing I came prepared. I presented the reserve's official designation, the glowing assessment from the biologist, and a stack of letters from local families praising the lake's impact on the community. Then I played the footage of Greg trespassing near my property line, complete with audio of his disparaging remarks about saving the stupid fish. The zoning board didn't just dismiss the complaint, they issued a warning to the HOA for filing frivolous claims. Greg's face was a mix of fury and humiliation, but I wasn't finished yet. With the HOA's credibility in tatters, I turned my attention to the community. I hosted a public open house at the reserve, inviting neighbors to fish, kayak, and learn about conservation. The event was a resounding success, drawing dozens of families and even a reporter from the local paper. The resulting article, titled "Local Landowner Turns HOA Feud into Conservation Triumph," was the cherry on top. Greg's position was growing more precarious by the day, and I could see the cracks forming. All it would take was one final push to bring his little empire crashing down. Greg's downfall began not with a bang, but with an HOA meeting, one he had no idea was being recorded. A former board member, fed up with Greg's antics and emboldened by the reserve's popularity, secretly filmed the proceedings and sent me the footage. It was a goldmine. The recording captured Greg admitting to redrawing HOA boundaries without proper authorization, using HOA funds for personal expenses, and most damning of all, intentionally targeting non-HOA properties to bolster the group's budget. His arrogance was on full display, complete with sneering comments about freeloaders like me. Armed with this evidence, I took it straight to the county's legal department. Within weeks, an investigation was underway. The county issued subpoenas for HOA financial records, and Greg's house of cards began to collapse. The audit revealed years of embezzlement and fraudulent activity. The fines he'd levied on me and others had never made it into the Community Improvement Fund. They'd gone straight into Greg's pocket. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. But the real poetic justice came at the next HOA election. A coalition of fed-up residents, led by Maria and a few other outspoken critics, organized a campaign to oust Greg and his cronies. The election was a landslide. Greg was not only removed as president but also banned from holding any future leadership positions in the community. The new board immediately voted to dissolve the HOA, citing irreparable damage to its reputation. Meanwhile, the reserve continued to flourish. The open house had become an annual tradition, attracting families, students, and even local officials. The Texas Wildlife Department recognized the reserve as a model for private conservation efforts, and I was invited to speak at a regional conference about turning conflict into community impact. But my favorite moment came one crisp autumn afternoon, when a group of kids from the local elementary school visited the reserve. As I watched them fishing off the dock, laughing and marveling at the herons gliding across the water, I felt a deep sense of pride. What had started as a petty feud had transformed into something meaningful, something bigger than me. As for Greg, the last I heard he was facing charges for embezzlement and fraud. His McMansion went up for sale, and the new owners tore down the gaudy fountain he'd installed in the front yard. Fittingly, they replaced it with a native wildflower garden, a small but satisfying symbol of nature reclaiming its space. Before the HOA's dissolution, I had one final plaque installed at the edge of the lake. Read: Blue Heron Wildlife Reserve, established 2025. Dedicated to the community and the spirit of conservation. And to the HOA, may it rest in peace. Life on the ranch settled back into its natural rhythm. The lake sparkled in the sunlight, the herons nested undisturbed, and the ranch fishing club thrived under its new name. The fight with Greg had been exhausting, but in the end, it had given me something far greater than the satisfaction of revenge. It had given me a legacy.